Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Earth Day 2021. It's wonderful to look across the chat and see people joining us from around the world. My name is Jay Famiglietti. I'm your host for today's community forum. I'm the executive director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. 1 degree Celsius. It's a difference on global average that will displace millions. Here in the prairies of Canada, we're seeing warming at 3 times the global average. Climate change is here. Extreme events are happening now, like the freezing in Texas, the worst wildfires California's ever seen, the hurricanes that are tearing apart Louisiana. What about the extensive drought and the heat waves that are leading to crop failures, or the slow destruction of coastal regions as sea level rise inundates and erodes them? And up north, as the permafrost melts away, houses, infrastructure, and communities collapse, while stored water drains away. With the onset of these events comes the Great Climate Migration. To call it the Great Migration is no exaggeration. By 2070, 1 in 3 people will be forced to choose between persevering in tenuously inhabitable regions or to move. We'll be playing a game of Tetris with people's lives and livelihoods. And because we still haven't quite mastered life in our space, where do those 3 billion people move to? Who's paying for it? Who's responsible for it? What does this mean for human security? We're going to dig into all of that today. Before I introduce our panel, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting up here in Saskatoon from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. We know that many of you are joining us from around the world. I hope that you'll take a moment to acknowledge and pay respect to one another as well. Today on this 51st Earth Day, by the way, I remember the first one. I was 10 years old. I'm joined by 3 remarkable individuals working towards communicating the implications of climate migration. Robin Bronin, Jesse Keenan, and Abram Lustgarten. Robin Bronin is a senior research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and is the executive director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. She was awarded the Robert Hickerson Public Service Award in 2007 and the International Human Rights Award in 2012. She's working as an expert on climate-induced planned relocations with the UN High Commission for Refugees and is a member of the advisory group for the Nansen Initiative. Jesse Keenan is an associate professor and social scientist on the faculty of the School of Architecture at Tulane University. He served on many resilience, recovery, and adaptation planning teams. He's been a chair and vice chair for the U.S. Community Resilience Panel for Buildings and Infrastructure Systems, a federal interagency initiative formerly under the Obama White House Climate Action Plan. Keenan is also the executive producer of the climate change podcast, America Adapts, which was nominated for Best Green Podcast at the 2021 iHeartRadio Podcast Awards. Abram Lustgarten is a senior environmental reporter with ProPublica with a focus at the intersection of business, climate, and energy. His 2015 series examining the causes of water scarcity in the American West, called Killing the Colorado, was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and received the 2016 Keck Futures Initiative Communication Award from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. His multi-part series in the New York Times, called The Great Climate Migration, is landmark reporting in this rapidly changing world of ours. Hello to all of you. And to start off, I'd like to ask you to all do a brief introduction, maybe mention some other things about your work that I might have missed in your introduction and how it relates to climate change. And we'll start with you, Abram, since you are a friend and a guest on our Let's Talk About Water podcast.
Well, hey, everyone. And thanks again for having me, Jay. It's good to see you again. You kind of stole my line. So I'll just tell you a little more about, the climate migration work that I did over the past year. We did 3 stories, and the first looked at global migration around the world, and in particular pressure on the United States coming from uprooted communities in Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico. And the second looked at what kind of shifts we'll see in the United States, or might expect to see in the United States, and that's already begun, but basically anticipating an enormous demographic shift in the United States. That's a story in which I learned so much of what I reported from Jesse Keenan. So I'm your secondhand source on that. And the third was a look at who, from a national perspective, might stand to benefit as these changes unfold. And so my reporting focused on Russia, its opportunities to grow its agricultural industry, take advantage perhaps of thawing land and perhaps needing more people to do that. But Canada is among those nations, as are Scandinavian nations, who could potentially see, economic growth, or at least the opportunity for economic growth as the climate warms. As a part of that reporting, we undertook an enormous data crunching and data modeling effort to try to put some numbers to these figures. You cited that 1 in 3 people on the planet. That comes from a study that influenced my work, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, that essentially found that for the past 6,000 years, humans have lived in a certain environmental niche, and as the climate changes, that niche is going to displace or at least move outside of the home territory of those 6,000, or of those 1/3 of the planet's population, of potentially 3 billion people. And around the world, we can expect, 1 to 3 billion of them to begin to migrate. And that's really been, the focus of what I've been looking at the last couple of years. And I'm eager for the discussion and to hear what the rest of you have to add to it as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Abram. Robin, let's move to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel. I want to honor the lands on which I work, of the Dena'ina, who were stewards of this lands for thousands of years. And I've been working on what I consider one of the worst issues in regard to climate forced displacement and the giant human rights challenges that are in front of us, because the US federal government has no agency or funding mandate to facilitate the movement of people. I've been working with Alaska Native communities for the last 15 years who have been advocating intensely with the US federal government to facilitate what they have determined is their longest and best adaptation strategy to deal with the climate crisis, and that is a community-wide relocation. 3 Alaska Native communities made that decision almost 25 years ago and have been advocating intensively to relocate from places that are now environmentally vulnerable. And none of them have yet been able to relocate, despite testifying in front of Congress. And many of you know that President Obama came to Alaska in 2015, and that is because of their advocacy. And we had great hope that he was going to actually move this issue to the front of his agenda so the communities in Alaska could be safe. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. One community of the 3, the community of Newtok, 1/3 of the community was able to relocate in 2019. 2/3, over 200 people, are now still not safe. It's important to understand when I'm talking about this, we're talking about remote indigenous communities where there are no roads. So when we get fall storms, which are hurricane strength, there is no evacuation route to which they can go. And so we've been working with them to frame this issue as a human rights issue and to create a governance framework that will protect their human rights now and far into the future.
Thanks very much, Robin. Jesse, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to join you. It's actually wonderful to see colleagues and friends and from across the world joining us today in India and Paraguay, Uruguay, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Colombia. It's really quite a privilege to join you and speak in my capacity, in my work, of which I'm not an expert. And indeed, it's a great privilege to join the 2 panelists today. Robin, in particular, being recognized, I think, globally and certainly domestically in terms of pioneering this body of work, thinking, theory, and ideas, but also practice. So my expertise is not in climate migration. My expertise is in real estate, housing, urban development. My work has been focused on climate change climate adaptation in the built environment, from regulatory, financial, and the broader economy of adaptation in the built environment. And my work in many ways can be defined, at least in recent years, of thinking about who can adapt, who has the what are the consequences of adaptation as well as maladaptation. And to what extent is there agency in regulatory bodies or policy agencies to get ahead of what I see is a broader set of market mechanisms that are pushing people in certain directions that leads, in many ways, exacerbates inequalities and further marginalizes many communities who themselves have been subject to historic marginalization. But I think across the board, when we think about a full range of decisions and a full range of impacts with climate change. And again, I think about this in the context of housing, fixed income assets, a kind of financial economy. It has such broad implications. And certainly when we think about sending zones, receiving zones, the governance that it takes for us to unite as communities, as individuals, the resources it takes to move elderly and health records. I mean, all of the complexities of society in its relocation, both orderly and disorderly, is such a amazing challenge. In many ways, I would also position it as an amazing opportunity. Now, there's certainly much that's lost along the way in terms of our livelihoods and social capital and the like. But I think for many people, in many places, there's an opportunity to think about sustainable urban development and to think about sustainability and what can we do not to create the footprint of our carbon intensive economy, but what can we do to create a greater accessibility, affordability, and greater stewardship of what little land I think we should be positioned ourselves in. And I say what little land because I draw that from the inspiration of the movies associated with the Film Fest that brings us here today. And so in many ways, I'll stop there, but it's a great privilege to join you. And I think that both of our panelists today shine the light and have done so for many years. And it's something that I think is worthy of further broader national discussion, and certainly a national discussion within federal policy as we move forward in the United States.
Thanks very much, Jesse. So let's talk a little terminology, because I think sometimes there's a lot of language that get thrown around when we talk about climate migration. So Abram, let's start with you. Could you tell us what climate migration is and what's the difference between a climate migrant and a refugee?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, a climate migrant is somebody who's forced to move because of, or becomes, what we think of as a refugee because of changes in their environment, because they can't access enough water, or they can't grow enough food, or it's too hot to survive or to thrive, or some other environmentally related reason. But the fact is, the term refugee is a legal term. It's defined by the United Nations, and it technically, for whatever, to the extent that matters, technically doesn't include the kind of climate refugees that we're talking about. It refers to people displaced by conflict in particular. And it's partially because the phrase is loaded with obligations for member states of the United Nations to do something about it, which maybe we'll talk about, but there's a reluctance to do something about climate migrants so far. And the other lesson for me about who is a climate migrant is that it's not so simple. Climate is something that influences and plays a role among many in the reasons why people choose to migrate. In my reporting, I went out searching for those clean, clear-cut examples, and they're few and far between. And what you find instead is that drought and a failed crop coincided with, fights that somebody's kids had at school, and the lack of jobs and the political corruption in the Guatemalan environment where people lived, and all of these kind of swirl together, and push somebody to make a decision to migrate. There are rare examples where a community is, inundated by sea level rise, and that might be, true climate migration. But in general, what we should see or understand is that, climate is an exacerbating factor. It's a weight on a collection of factors that do push people to ultimately migrate.
May I add something?
Yes, please, go for it.
Thank you. So I've worked as an immigration attorney in the United States for many years. And I think one of the things that is really important to understand in this context, and why I actually created the word climate migration so people would stop using the word climate refugees, is because the whole concept of being a refugee is that your government is either persecuting or torturing you or failing to control other people who are persecuting and torturing you. So the bonds between you as a citizen of that country and your national government are broken or have been broken. And in this context of the climate crisis, what we really need to be focusing on is building the capacity of national governments to be able to handle the internal migration that is going to be the primary way that people respond to this crisis. And if you look internationally, there are many countries in the world that are doing everything possible to advocate for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions because they are desperately concerned about the impact of the climate crisis on the people living within their country.
I think I might have been muted. Jesse, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree, and I would say that not only is it about a national capacity, it's also about, at least here in the United States, it's about local and state capacity. And indeed, when we think in infrastructural terms, whether that's social services or even water infrastructure, which, by the way, I think is a key element in terms of the spatial economy of where people ultimately invest in their lives, livelihoods, and communities, water being a key element of that, of course. But it's ultimately going to be the responsibility of local governments, particularly here in the United States. The other thing I would note, and it was hinted at a little bit a minute ago, which is that, I think there's a continuum, and I think we can understand this along a continuum of push and pull factors. And on one end of the continuum, we have those who are really lose everything, and they lose everything along the way, in both in their communities, their homes, their livelihoods, and the like. Then on the other end of the continuum, there's people who have the elective mobility. They actually have the means to move, and they're already thinking about where do they want to make long-term investments in their lives and in generational wealth transfer. What can they build and leave for their families and their communities? And so I think it's a very wide spectrum indeed as we begin to understand this. And what I am most concerned with in many ways as a matter of policies, what happens to the people who do not have those means, right? What happens to the people who do not have a body or a collective agency around them to help them transition? Who gets left behind? And that's, I think, one of the scariest things in many ways, because we're on that precipice now. And these decisions that we make today will dictate the path of our success in the future or failure.
So it's pretty sobering stuff from everyone so far. So I want to drill down on this question of capacity. So Robin, let's go back to you. So it looks like we're talking about governance tools, policies, protection. I know this is something you're working on. Well, what is the framework? What would it look like?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I think one of the things is that we're not focused on what I call a relocation decision-making process. And what I mean by that is communities, because Jesse is right in regard to this is going to be a local governing entity's decision-making process with the people living within that community, is they need very localized ecosystem-specific information about what's happening with their environment. And as we know, that it's going to be a combination of extreme weather events and slow ongoing environmental change like sea level rise and erosion, which is going to force people to leave the places they call home. So one of the pieces in this relocation decision-making process and what we've implemented in Alaska with the tribes is doing community-based environmental monitoring, that is using and working with their indigenous knowledge and then scaling it up with state and federal government representatives so that they can understand the predictive rate of change of, for instance, erosion. Because one of the pieces about relocation is that it is a long-term process, meaning in the best of circumstances, it would be at a minimum a 3 to 5 year process of actually not only moving infrastructure, but moving people and creating or maintaining livelihoods. So, and in order to have that be a planned process, it's really important that these decisions are made while people are still living in the places they call home. Because if they're displaced because of an extreme weather event, they are going to be focused on their emergency needs for food, housing, water, healthcare. And it's going to be very hard to what I call protect the most important human right in this context, which is the right to self-determination. And what you also need with doing the community-based environmental monitoring is understanding what the thresholds are, so that when you meet those thresholds, in environmental and social thresholds like saline intrusion in potable water, that you then facilitate a relocation process to a relocation site that has been previously determined.
So yeah, it's very interesting, Robin. It makes a lot of sense that understanding those rates of change and the things that are happening locally need to be observed locally. So the community-based observations, yeah, I really understand the importance of that. So Abram, do you think this is applicable to other communities around the globe? So, for example, what you saw in Central America?
Yeah, to degrees. I mean, what I found in Central America, and we've talked about before, was a level of sort of sheer desperation coupled with an incredible lack of support, from the federal government. So when you talk about, what's there isn't much to speak of for local governments in the region where I was. So you look at the Guatemalan federal government. One of the things that's interesting, for example, is the rural communities there where migration was originating is largely because of food insecurity driven by drought, and yet Guatemala's total crop production was increasing, and it's because they have so much large corporate farming of fruits in particular for exports, or palm oil, and the government supports those large corporate farms, or the corporate farms have the capital to invest in water infrastructure, for example, to build dams or have water systems that can provide in times of drought to irrigate their fields. The rural area, the larger segments of population, don't have any infrastructure support. They don't have access to the food and so forth. So, that's just sort of one little window into the gap left by, potential government support. And then, just to switch gears for a second, if I will, I was thinking as Robin and Jesse were talking, about in the United States, when we think about government support and communities and transparency of information about climate, that here in particular, those communities often have a conflicted interest. And, this is something Jesse and I have talked about a whole lot, but, what's happening in the climate and what the data shows often runs against the development objectives or the economic growth objectives of local communities, the re-election objectives of local officials. And so, there's no easy solution to these trends, but there's a tension there. And so when we start talking about, communities changing and the habitability, in American towns changing in some cases anyway, what's the best interest for the people is not always what's in the best interest of that community, or at least the community that's resistant to that long-term change. Those are two things I see happening here.
The three of you are from the United States. What is the status? I mean, do you think that this is getting the right attention? I know it's early days for Biden administration. Do you think it will get the proper level of attention in the U.S.? Anybody, just I'll open it up.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that it is certainly not getting the attention for a lot of reasons which are debatable and certainly understandable. The Biden administration, its current iteration of domestic climate policy, is largely focused on climate mitigation and GHG and reduction of GHG. And obviously, those are central goals to our obligations as global citizens. But the climate adaptation element of this, not just in the context that brings us here today, but in broader terms, is really a missing piece in terms of policy and specifically personnel at this moment. Now, early days on, right? So we're just getting going. It's going to take a long time, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, to staff, to get the personnel, to find some guidance from Congress and the like. And there's certainly early movement in progress, I think, in internalizing environmental justice, which is a set of principles and values and facts that can be integrated in guiding the allocation of resources and to develop policy going forward. And certainly the progression of a climate change, or I'm sorry, an infrastructure bill, an infrastructure national plan is central. But there's some key missing elements here. And I think on one level, people in the White House see adaptation and resilience problems and solutions in general as sort of bad politics. It's local, as Abram set up. Adaptation for one group may be maladaptive to the other. It's a kind of political lose-lose in many situations. There's no core win there. And I think that's really an unfortunate perspective, and I hope that changes, and I hope that changes before hurricane and wildfire season. Because what we need is a national commitment to internalize adaptation in a wide variety of policies on how we not only engage with physical infrastructure, but the delivery of social services, which are allied to the shocks and stresses of climate change in education and healthcare. I mean, it's hard to disaggregate these things, even from affordability of housing, which is in my domain of expertise, if not competence. So I think on many levels, we're getting there. We're moving extremely slowly. The major priority is mitigation. And what I'm afraid of is that without that centralizing force and guidance from adaptation, for instance, through a true national adaptation plan, which spatializes the dimensions of where investment and disinvestment is going to go. I mean, there's plenty of places in this country where I think an national infrastructure plan could certainly put investments in infrastructure that are truly maladaptive, that are putting people at greater risk. They become reliant on that type of infrastructure, which has an underlying fragility that we cannot fully account for, much less maintain. And we can talk about that in a lot of different places throughout this country. But the investments that we make today in infrastructure will create a lot of path dependency, again, on our capacity to think about managed retreat and managed relocation in the years to come.
Robin, would you like to follow up on that?
Yes. I think I'm unmuted now. So I think one of the things that's really important to understand in this context is that the United States, and the United States is not alone, has an awful legacy of forced relocation, particularly of indigenous populations. And so it's really caused I think, federal government, I know in Alaska, the state government has been extraordinarily reluctant to step into this space because most countries in the world have absolutely no desire to manage the internal movement of their populations. And I think it's really important to understand that is we're asking governments to step into this space that has historically traumatized millions of people all over the world and ask them to take leadership to protect people from the climate impacts that are only going to accelerate far into the future, which is the reason why I always talk about it's essential that this be human rights based. The other thing that I will note, which was really disappointing to me, is that in President Biden's executive orders, he did on February 4th address the issue of climate change and migration. But it was only focused on, it was put into an international context. There was nothing in the executive orders that focus on this urgent need, especially in Alaska, to scale up the federal government response so that Indigenous communities can be safe.
So, when it comes to complicated messages like this, actually, you make it pretty straightforward. But I wonder how we get that message out, and we can, use the U.S. for an example because you are all actively working on it. So Robin and Jesse are actively researching it. Abram, you're actively writing about it. I mean, what does it take? What do we need to do to, in this case, get the current administration to think about, as you said, Jesse, including it as part of a national infrastructure plan? What steps are you taking? What steps can we take?
Well, I think, one of the pieces, so in the infrastructure plan, there's actually, I think, 5 words that say that the infrastructure plan will provide relocation assistance to Indigenous communities in Alaska. And it's because of their tremendous advocacy in this space. And so from my perspective, I think that other communities, I think the challenge is people don't want to leave their homes. And so that's what they're saying. And their local leaders are listening to that. And so it's going to take activism on the ground to say, this is what we want, in order for local leaders and federal politicians to actually respond and create a national framework, as Jesse was mentioning.
Yeah, again, this sort of right of self-determination, I think, is super, super important. Sounded like someone else wanted to speak, but I can't see any other faces. So Jesse, Abram?
I'll just add, I think Robin's right about the, sort of lack of domestic focus, but I'm a little bit more optimistic about the early, signs or signals that the Biden administration's offered, because that executive order that, that Robin mentioned, it calls for all the right stuff. Biden's asking for an assessment, of everything from how do you define a climate migrant to what should opportunities be for relocating or accepting people from outside of the country. Perhaps that implies relocation or support for people inside of the country as well. An assessment of its implications for global security and so forth. And when I looked at the list of advisors that are leading this effort, which I think they just released this morning. And it's a lot of the right people. It's people with State Department expertise. It's people like Alex DeShervinen at Columbia University, who bring the sort of academic perspective that's needed. And my impression is that this won't necessarily be a bureaucratic process. And I don't know what will come of it, or if it will, sufficiently begin to address the domestic American issues that we're talking about right now. But but it's only been 90 days or so, and it seems like things are at least headed in the right direction.
So let's turn. So our time with this panel discussion is going pretty quickly, and in about 8 minutes, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. But I want to turn to who's responsible financially, who's responsible legally. So I'll just throw it out there to anyone who wants to respond. Robin, did you want to take a stab at it?
Sure. So I'm talking in the context of the Indigenous communities with whom I work, and the federal government bears responsibility completely for this issue, because in Alaska, the Indigenous communities that I work with along the coast, they were forcibly placed there because the federal government determined that in last century that Indigenous communities needed to send their children to school. Barges came up the west coast of Alaska, dumped the construction materials in the places that were easiest for the barge to land. And then communities settled around these very environmentally vulnerable places. So it's because of the federal government that in Alaska, Indigenous communities are permanently settled, many of them in these really vulnerable places. So I think the federal government needs to bear the responsibility of making these communities are safe.
Jesse, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we can think about it in two dimensions. We can think about it at a broader socialization of risk through backstops like the National Flood Insurance Program or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which hold huge amounts of debt or liability associated with our financing of mortgages in areas which will be inundated within the useful life of either the mortgage or the buildings. There's an enormous component of our economy. A little under 20% of our GDP is associated with real estate, housing, and the built environment. And within particularly coastal areas, riverine areas, but also elements of extreme heat are critical to this dialogue as well. And certainly a formal element of water scarcity in the United States. There's just, we're all liable. There's liability for local governments to, once they go through the process of investing in vulnerability assessments and the like, and developing a certain intelligence about what these risks and uncertainties are in the future, they have a public obligation to be stewards of their communities and their jurisdictions to make investments. So they have liabilities when they don't necessarily advance these interests. We have liabilities, and it's diffused systematically. And the risk of climate change is systematic to the extent that there's a certain paradox that we will pay as citizens, as consumers, or both. It challenges the long-term economic viability and welfare of a vast elements of our society, and particularly in light of economic inequality as it stands in America, which, by the way, is not necessarily heading in the direction that one would find some faith and progressive ambition in understanding, but rather as we have greater inequality and we begin to, and climate change simply exacerbates that. And there are financial consequences as well as legal liabilities associated with action and inaction. But it will shake out in political terms. And going back to our, and talking a little bit about the political geography of this, which is sort of interesting, it's come to mind of late, is that, you know, particularly as we see more urbanites and urban coastal people of means who have the capacity to relocate, you're starting to see, particularly in the East Coast of the United States, these are urbanites, or and they're generally a little bit more left-leaning, Democratic, self-identified Democrats rather, more progressives in a way, and they're moving into increasingly conservative parts of the country. And I was talking with someone in South Dakota recently, and there was a number of people that were moving into South Dakota, coming from these more progressive coastal places. And, you know, it kind of dawned on them that, you know, there was a margin of Republican victory by like 1,000 votes. And by some account, there was going to be enough people in the next 10 years to flip this particular county or city rather to Democrat, and a long-standing Republican thing. And I think that's really interesting because as in America, we have more urban progressives moving into more rural places of the country. There's all kinds of challenges, environmental carrying capacity, and there's plenty of things of crowding out, climate gentrification. There's a million problems and challenges along with this. But one interesting thing in terms of political geography is this idea that we begin to diffuse a different type of value system. And I think that heterogeneity of values that people bring with them, it could be a potentially positive outcome for our society. It could be totally devastating as well.
So Abram, yeah, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, two quick thoughts. I mean, Jesse flicked at urbanization, and to the extent that I think that a rapid urbanization will be one of the effects we see in the United States, you know, our infrastructure challenges of past and future, you know, are a part of the liability and obligation. So, you know, the failure to invest in water, in public transit, and so forth already, and then how we choose to do that in the past will directly, you know, intersect with this issue of migration in the United States. But I also just wanted to say, you know, globally, there's a growing argument, you know, no surprise to anyone here, you know, that the United States bears some, you know, disproportionate responsibility for helping people elsewhere because we've disproportionately contributed to warming the climate in the first place. there's short-term and long-term solutions, and foreign aid is a really substantial and effective immediate short-term solution to this challenge. I visited sites in El Salvador run by the UN, the World Food Program, where $32,000 built a greenhouse in a drought-stricken area where an entire village was really on the cusp of leaving the country, and they've stayed, and they're prosperous, and they're happier for it. The lead subject in my story that I wrote about Guatemala, who did leave and came to Texas, he requested his farm co-op, his village of 40 people, they requested an irrigation system that would bring water from a river that was less than a quarter of a mile away at a cost of $800. They were turned down by the Guatemalan government. And that's an example of a place where an American government program or U.S. aid or even a philanthropist can step in and have a direct, immediate impact that changes the migration equation.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to turn now to open questions, and I believe that we're going to see a slide pop up, and magically questions will appear like this one. What can the individual do in this when thinking about where we live? And I'll just leave that open to anyone. I think Robin's talking and she must be muted.
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. I think one of the things that people can do, as I mentioned, is doing community-based environmental monitoring where you live, because this is going to affect, as I said, very local ecosystems, and we need to understand how they are changing so that we can make decisions about what needs to happen in order for us to adapt. Because we know that the climate crisis is not only accelerating, but it's non-linear. So while we may understand what has happened in the past, that is no indication for what will happen in the future.
Thank you, Robin. Sean, do we have another question? Maybe we caught him off guard. Here we go. Even if we cut emissions today and use strictly renewable resources, it wouldn't make a difference for years. How can we make change now? Someone else, Abram or Jesse?
Well, certainly we're baked into hundreds of years of climate change, as they suggest, and the sensitivity of the climate to what we have is still greatly uncertain in many aspects. But what we understand is the proportionality and disproportionality of impact on ecosystems, socioecological relationships, and the like. I think in the context of what brings us here today and climate migration and the like, and there's a lot of different perspectives on this, but I think that if we were to position ourselves within the context of a country or a democracy, we have to make decisions, and let's hope they're democratic decisions or decisions from which there is a localized governance, if not individual agency, in determining what we want to protect and what we want to let go. There's a scarcity of resources. And we need to make some tough decisions. And I think one of the things that we can do is have this conversation today about our collective future. And if we don't do that, we're going to be caught off guard in ways that will lead, that will be quite devastating and will not yield the opportunities to transition social capital, right? Not just financial and infrastructure and all of that jazz, but what does it mean together to build communities and to transition communities? And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about the trajectory that we're on. Doesn't mean that we need to be doom and gloom. I think we can always find opportunities here. And in fact, in the definition of the IPCC, it's not just managing the impacts of climate change, it's also about the opportunities that arise. And I think it's critical for us to think about, again, as I referenced earlier, and bringing us back to water, how do we reposition ourselves wherever we end up so that we are stewards of water and stewards of water infrastructure and a one water model or system. in a way that is truly sustainable, because if not, we're just going to be making these decisions every few generations in a long, long haul of migration. And so let's try to think about the opportunities that bring us together, that don't separate us.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks for bringing it back to water. How will this impact different demographics? Abram, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, climate disproportionately affects, people of color, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So, there's an inherent environmental justice component that Jesse has taught me all about. But without intentional and immediate interference in those sort of historical patterns, that's what we can expect going forward. I mean, you'll see, the hardest hit communities, whether it's going to be in Louisiana or in Guatemala, being those that are least privileged. To the extent that migration is a measure of mobility, I think it's already been mentioned here, but mobility takes means, and so on one end of the spectrum, you have those privileged enough to be able to adapt to the changing circumstances they see before them. In the middle, is probably the group to be. Well, I don't know which to be most concerned about, but in the middle, you have a group that struggles to adapt, attempts to move, or whose conditions worsen. And at the bottom end of the spectrum, we have people who are simply trapped or left behind. And that might be left behind from a community that to adapt picked up and moved, or it might be left behind in a community that's boxed out behind a closed border that will no longer allow immigration. But the effects are not equal.
Thanks, Abram. Sean, another question. How do we connect people to go for community-based environment management? Maybe back to you, Robin.
Yeah, so I would say the way that we started our work is we went to the indigenous communities and asked them what they were concerned about environmentally. So if the person asking this question lives in a community and you know what the issues are that you're worried about, like flooding or erosion, is figuring out what local government agency could work with you to implement it, so that you're connecting what you're observing on the ground with getting that higher scale predicted rate of change, which is going to be critically important for understanding the type of adaptation strategy that could be implemented to protect your community for the long term.
Thanks, Robin. Next question, please. How can developing countries cope with the climate issue, as they are under debt of developed countries, so they have to follow their policies instead of what is better to cope? Jesse, you want to take a crack at that?
I will, in part because this came up today in the U.S. Climate Summit run by the U.S. State Department. There is a global debt crisis. There's too much money in the world. There's just trillions of dollars, not just in cash, but in derivatives markets. The global financial economy has more money than we fully even understand. And a component of that, of course, is putting folks in debt, in countries in debt. And as we think about that, that's been one element, of course, of broader ambitions with sustainable development goals. And that we've needed growth in the global economy to help pay for advancements that we have had in sustainable development goals. But there's also a wicked dilemma there in the burdens that debt places on societies, in the extent to which the repayment of that debt and the renegotiation or negotiation of that debt itself dictates the terms of what these domestic economies and policies have to prioritize. And it very often prioritizes structural fixed income assets, and it prioritizes revenue, and it prioritizes a certain materiality in structural terms that overlooks the opportunities to adapt in non-structural terms, that over-adapts other elements of non-economic determinants of social and environmental welfare that are critically problematic. Now, I think there's one development globally in this context, which is accounting and environmental accounting, and the extent to which there are advances now in environmental accounting that begin to put a dollar figure, if you will, a Canadian dollar figure, if you will, on ecosystem services and ecosystem services valuation. And I think, there's a little bit of a slippery slope there, of course, and we can't economize everything. The intrinsic value of nature is something that defies the economization, of course. But I think there are elements from which there are new values. And I think once we register these new values, we can at least try to negotiate out of this debt crisis through the propagation and investment in natural resources and ecologies and the underlying human management of these ecologies and environments. And I hope that that is potentially a path forward. And it's already one that we talk about globally in terms of nature-based solutions and things like this. But in the context of scale, the global debt crisis that we face now, particularly in the global South, is enormous, and it will dictate where priorities are and resources for both climate mitigation and climate adaptation.
Thanks very much, Jesse. So rather than take another question from the audience, so Jesse, you sort of nicely pivoted to a question I wanted to ask about things like innovations, what sort of gives you hope? And so I think you just gave us your take on, innovations that could affect change. And I want to go back to Robin and Abram, maybe take a minute each to talk about, what are things that give you hope, innovations that might be out there, and then we'll wrap it up. And if you're just like really depressed, that's okay too. I feel your pain.
Well, honestly, I am really depressed. Yeah, because, as I mentioned, the indigenous tribes in Alaska have been advocating on these issues now for a couple of decades, and we've seen very little government response. What gives me hope, honestly, is I feel like in the United States, we are in a moment of understanding how racial injustice and colonization have tremendously harmed all of us living in the United States. And the hope is, for me, and this is part of the work that we're doing with the tribes, is if we are able to, what I call, decolonize the systems that have caused these communities to be environmentally vulnerable, to not be able to get the resources they need, and vision a future where there truly is justice and equity, that there's tremendous opportunity. Because I think it was Jesse who mentioned, the movement of people to new areas, urban areas, rural areas, and we have to reconceive how human settlements are going to be. And this is our opportunity to make sure that when we're doing that, we're making sure that it's racially just and not a continuation of the colonization that has been in this country since the country came into existence.
Thanks very much, Abram.
Well, I was trying to go first because I didn't want to have the last word, because it is an overwhelmingly pessimistic landscape in my view. But I think that I can find a sliver of hope, sort of in what Robin was saying, that there's this moment of coming to truth with history and inequities, and perhaps for the United States in particular, but for the developed world, perhaps there's an opportunity to speak to that through economics, because that's been an effective tool for us in the past. And I'm thinking about like the demographic decline that the United States is on the precipice of, that Canada certainly is, where there is a need in terms of economic growth for more people, and it's compatible with the need that other people have to move and relocate. And if we can kind of meld that this newfound appreciation, for inequality and others, with the possibility for mutual benefit, and growth that stems from accepting a bit of a reorganization and openness, then maybe that's a way out of an otherwise bleak sort of recipe for more friction, I think.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. It was a real pleasure. Bram, Jesse, Robin. If you're interested in any of our guests' books or articles, they can be found on our webpage, which is letstalkaboutwater.ca. The panel discussion will also be available on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our Let's Talk About Water podcast. As Jesse mentioned about the films, as we've done each month this year, we have 2 new films available to watch for free as part of our Let's Talk About Water Film Festival from today through May 20th. These 2 films, and we'd seen some of the trailers at the beginning of the program, The Church Forest of Ethiopia and Treeline, and they explore climate adaptation and migration through the lens of our planet's lungs, that is, trees. Please visit letstalkaboutwater.ca to watch those films for free. And for more events and films and our podcast and the 2021 Film Prize, if you submit a short 2-minute film about water by next Friday, April 30th, you will be eligible for the chance to win $10,000 US. So please think about it. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us on this Earth Day 2021. Have a great day.